Boris Johnson compares the French president to a wartime prison guard over Brexit.
If Monsieur Hollande wants to administer punishment beatings to anybody who chooses to escape, rather in the manner of some sort of World War II movie, then I don't think that is the way forward.
A day on from Theresa May's landmark speech, it caused frustration in Downing Street and a sharp rebuke from European leaders.
Everybody needs to act adult, and we need to act in a pragmatic way. It's a very complicated situation.
Also on News at 10 tonight.
Thank you very much, Press Corps. Good luck.
President Obama waves goodbye to the White House. What now for the hopes and fears of Americans under Donald Trump? The European head of Facebook speaks exclusively to News at 10 on the phenomenon of fake news, which she says it takes very seriously. And a pioneer for women in sport, Rachel Hayhoe-Flint, the World Cup winning cricket captain, has died.
This is ITV News at 10 with Raghi Omar.
Good evening. It was all going so well for Prime Minister Theresa May this morning. It was the day after she delivered the most important speech of her premiership on Brexit, and there had been positive responses from Europe. German Chancellor Angela Merkel welcomed the clarity, and the President of the European Council said it was warm and balanced and in the spirit of Churchill. Then enter Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. He may have written a book on Winston Churchill, but he chose a very different reference to the 1940s. He didn't use the word Nazi, but he likened French President François Hollande to a wartime prison guard administering a punishment beating. You can imagine the outcry.
Theresa May's carefully worded Brexit speech won a cautious welcome from European leaders from Berlin to Strasbourg today. But then Boris Johnson got involved with some very undiplomatic language. Responding to comments from a French government source, Mr Johnson compared the French president to a World War II prison guard.
I think that if Monsieur Hollande wants to administer punishment beatings to anybody who chooses to escape, rather in the manner of some sort of World War II movie, then I don't think that is the way forward.
The French did not respond, but the Labour Party did.
I think that in Britain we find Boris funny. I think that people across the world are completely bewildered as to why it is that we have Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary, who's supposed to be leading our diplomatic corps.
Number 10 aides were clearly exasperated the day after Mrs May's big speech to find themselves having to explain that the Foreign Secretary had not called anyone a Nazi. In truth, it was not the worst gaffe anyone has ever made, maybe not even the worst Boris Johnson has made, but it was supremely unhelpful on the day when European leaders were falling over themselves to say diplomatic things about Mrs May's Brexit plan. Heads were turning across Europe at Mrs May's approach. Angela Merkel, hosting the Italian Prime Minister, said she now had a clearer impression of what Mrs May wanted. The be-all and end-all is that Europe does not let itself be divided, she said, and we'll ensure that by staying closely in touch. The European Council President said Britain couldn't just pick and choose during negotiations, but he did think Mrs May was more Churchillian than Donald Trump.
I want to underline that we took note of the warm and balanced words of Prime Minister May on European integration, which were much closer to the narrative of Winston Churchill than that of the American President-elect Trump.
There was no such high praise back home, where Labour latched onto suggestions that Brexit could mean lower corporate taxes.
Can I urge her to stop her threat of a bargain basement Brexit? A low-pay tax haven on the shores of Europe.
What I set out yesterday was a plan for a global Britain bringing prosperity to this country. I've got a plan. He doesn't have a clue.
But as Mrs May travelled on to Switzerland for a meeting of world economic leaders, a new obstacle came into focus. The Supreme Court will announce on Tuesday whether it will order her to hold a parliamentary vote before triggering the Brexit process. Carl Dinnan, News at 10.
Boris Johnson's criticism of President Hollande echoed all the way back from India, where he made the speech, to Switzerland, where world leaders and international bankers are meeting at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Among them, Sweden's Prime Minister, who spoke to our political editor, Robert Peston, who joins us now. Robert, what did the Swedish Prime Minister say to you?
Well, as you say, Raggy, remarks seen as insulting to the French president were heard all the way up here on the top of this freezing Swiss mountain. And this is what Stefan Löfven, the Swedish Prime Minister, told me.
We have said all the time from the Swedish point of view that we need to act, everybody needs to act adult, and we need to act in a pragmatic way. It's a very complicated situation. It's not good for the European Union, so let's not make it worse.
How realistic is it that we will be able to agree a deal in 2 years?
That's my belief, that this is too short time, because it is so complex. We need an agreement about the withdrawal, how to leave the European Union. You need an agreement on the new relationship, and you need something in between, the transition period. And in my view, I think it's optimistic to believe that only takes 2 years.
So here we are, the day after that historic speech by Theresa May, and we're beginning to learn the hard reality of what people here see as a very hard Brexit. Stefan Löfven, the Swedish Prime Minister, is just one of the EU leaders who will determine whether Theresa May gets what you want. Now, something else he said to me, very striking, is that her hope that she can have a free trade deal that's very similar to the free trade deal we've got at the moment is for the birds. He said very clearly, unambiguously, that when you join a club, you have to follow the rules of the club. When you leave the club, if you're no longer prepared to play by the rules, you don't get the benefits. Now, there are other officials and ministers here who I've been talking to. Frankly, they're all in a bit of shock after the speech of yesterday. Yes, they welcome clarity about what her position is, but the extent to which they see her as turning back on a project which Britain helped to build, well, you know, they are finding this very hard to come to terms with.
All right, Robert, in Davos, thank you very much, and stay warm. So there is plenty of persuading the Prime Minister has to do in Davos, as we were hearing from Robert there, and not just amongst the politicians, though. Judging by a few job announcements today, some international bankers also need some persuading. HSBC said it might move 1,000 staff based in London to Paris in 2 years' time. The Swiss bank UBS said 1,000 of its staff could also leave the UK, and Goldman Sachs is reported to be considering a halving of its London workforce from 6,000 to 3,000, with 1,000 jobs relocating to Frankfurt, all because, allegedly, of Brexit. The countdown to a Trump presidency, now just 42 hours away, also means time is ticking away to the end of President Obama's 8 years in office. And this evening, as he gave his final news conference, Mr. Obama was full of reflections about the scale of his job, the future of America. But he was optimistic. I think we're going to be okay. He said about his daughters, man, they are something, as the president and proud father put it.
As the president held his final press conference, with many Democrats in a state of alarm and even grief, he tried for the last time to be a voice of reason and calm.
At my core, I think we're going to be okay. We just have to fight for it, we have to work for it, and not take it for granted.
But he also warned the incoming Trump administration to be cautious in how it acted in the Middle East and other trouble spots around the world.
If you're going to make big shifts in policy, just make sure you thought it through and understand that there are going to be consequences.
That warning to the president-elect came after Donald Trump arrived in Washington last night to make comments to foreign ambassadors, expressing goodwill and praising his own cabinet selections.
We have great respect for your countries. We have great respect for our world. We have put together a team, I think the likes of which has never been assembled before.
Shut it down! Shut it down! But there are sights and sounds he will become familiar with as he travels around Washington in the next few days. Protests are certain to build ahead of the swearing-in ceremony. No Trump! And a huge march against his presidency is planned for Saturday. On breakfast television this morning, Trump again denied that the Russians are holding any compromising material that could be used to blackmail him.
It's made up, never existed, never happened. And the reason I say that so strongly, because nothing's ever going to show up. There's never going to be a tape that shows up. There's never going to be anything that shows up.
But on Capitol Hill today, a sense of the epic political battle ahead. Trump's choice as America's top environmental regulator, refusing to be drawn on the cause of climate change.
I'm asking you a personal opinion.
My personal opinion is immaterial.
Really?
To the job of
you are going to be the head of the agency to protect the environment, and your personal feelings about whether climate change is caused by human activity and carbon emissions is immaterial?
Earlier today, Trump released this photograph, taken 3 weeks ago in Florida, apparently showing him writing his inaugural address. While preparations for the event are well underway, over 50 members of Congress are boycotting the ceremony.
You know, we have sore losers before, but this is really the first sore winner we've ever had. I will work with them where we can, but I just didn't want to go celebrate or legitimize or normalize his presidency.
Good luck. The next time we hear from President Obama, he will be a private citizen. And Donald Trump will have taken his place in the Oval Office, that innermost sanctum of American power.
So, Robert, President Obama's farewell was calm, it was level-headed, but as you were pointing out, an enormous amount of anxiety and division as we approach Trump's inauguration on Friday. What can we expect?
Well, the choreography of Friday has become just a little bit clearer. We know that the inaugural address by Donald Trump is going to be short at about 20 minutes. According to reports, he's written it largely himself without speechwriters being heavily involved. And if you can believe it, the overarching theme is going to be one of national unity. But to put it mildly, that's going to be a tough sell to millions of Americans because, of course, Donald Trump is a profoundly divisive and polarizing figure. And as you point out, Raghi, I mean, we saw the president living up to his reputation of being cool and dispassionate, to living up to his reputation as sort of no drama Obama. But there are reports circulating tonight that outgoing officials are increasingly alarmed at how the incoming administration may be woefully ill-prepared for a sort of international crisis on day one, that key jobs at the National Security Council are unfilled, that briefing papers have not been yet read. So even as we begin to approach this kind of ritual of democracy on Friday, there is no sense whatsoever of continuity, of business as usual, no sense really of what happens the day after.
Thank you, Robert, in Washington. Well, as Donald Trump prepares to take over, President Obama will perhaps look back on his 8 years in the White House with profound disappointment over his failure to bring in tougher gun laws, an issue he was passionately committed to after a string of campus massacres. Not even 3 weeks into 2017, and there have already been 721 shooting deaths in the United States. 162 of them, yes, 162 of them were children, just in the last 3 weeks. In 2016, 15,000 people were shot dead. More than a quarter of them, that's almost 4,000, were children. And it's on guns that we focus tonight in the third of our series on the hopes and fears of the American people about a Trump presidency. The gun lobby hopes the right to carry arms could actually be expanded. Certainly, that is what Martin Geisler found in Denver, Colorado. But he also found real fears that more guns will mean more deaths.
In a suburb of Denver, Colorado, paying customers are being taught a new skill. At the Active Shooter Response Center, civilians get military-style training in how to eliminate an armed threat. It is intense. But with gun crime so prevalent, there's a massive market for this.
It's a reality. You know, if I've got something that I care about, my children, my family, I want to be able to protect that. If there's a legitimate threat, then I need to know how to do that.
Guns are big business in Colorado. In this range alone, 1 million bullets are fired each month. The owner, Dick Abramson, sells firearms too. Lots of them.
They look ferocious.
Well, they're really fun to shoot.
The gun debate has divided America, but Dick and his customers believe they will now have a president who understands and supports their passion and their right to carry arms.
It bodes very well for the future because we believe that it's going to be a pro-gun administration. So we think our rights are going to be protected under the Second Amendment.
Look at all these students. This is just.
But this place has seen horrors inflicted with firearms as well. Columbine High School is just 15 miles from Dick's gun store. In 1999, 2 pupils murdered 12 fellow students and a teacher here in a massacre that shocked America.
It changed everything. I measure my life as before Columbine and after Columbine.
Tom Mauser's son Daniel was killed at Columbine. Since that day, he's devoted his life to a campaign for tighter gun laws. He's made some progress, but it's been hard. And now he fears President Trump will undo everything that's been achieved.
I think we're going to see a push for eliminating what they call the gun-free zones so that they allow for guns in schools, in public buildings, on military bases. You know, their whole thing is if we had more guns around, we'd be safer.
And you think Trump's going to buy into that?
I think Mr. Trump is going to be forced to buy into that.
This is what he means.
On November 8th, you, the 5 million men and women of the National Rifle Association of America.
The NRA, one of the most powerful lobby groups in this country, donated $30 million to the Trump campaign. Now, emboldened, they're demanding he ensures gun laws are changed.
This is our historic moment. To go on offense and defeat the forces that have aligned against our freedom once and for all.
Back at the firing range, a group of Girl Scouts have come in for a lesson.
Now make the rainbow. Yeah.
Aged just 11, they're being taught how to use a handgun safely. Not irresponsible, say their instructors, quite the opposite. But with more than 15,000 gun deaths in America last year alone, President Trump must decide how he's going to handle an epidemic that's causing misery nationwide. Martin Geisler, News at 10, Denver, Colorado.
So hopes and fears about guns in the United States. And in Mexico, there are many fears about other aspects of a Trump presidency and not much hope. While Mr. Trump has gone quiet about building the infamous wall, his promise to get American companies to move production from Mexico back to the United States is already taking effect.
Mexico can't blame Donald Trump for all its problems, but those protesting against rising fuel prices say he's making a bad situation worse. Gabriela Velasquez is dreading his presidency. The young marketing executive says, with neighbours like that, who needs enemies?
We're sick of it. We're worried that when Trump takes over, the economy will go down, but we're ready to fight.
No one has been more insulted by President-elect Trump than the Mexicans.
Drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
And nowhere fears it has more to lose.
We will build a great wall along the southern border.
Bubbles. That's bad news for Julia Romano and her daughters, and millions like her who live in rural Mexico. Her husband lives a world away in Chicago illegally and sends his money home. These so-called remittances from the US are Mexico's largest source of foreign income. But that money could now vanish, taxed to pay for the border wall. Julia's economic lifeline's at risk. There's nothing here, she told me. Since Mr. Trump arrived, I've been worried. Worried he'll be deporting people, or my money will stop. Some workers at American factories based here are worried too. Ford has just cancelled plans to expand here in favour of 700 jobs back in Michigan. 1,000 people work at this Ford plant outside Mexico City, and some of them fear making America great again will be at their expense. Carlos Mendoza is one of them. I'm worried, I'm very worried, he told me. It would affect us badly if I lost my job. I'd have to leave Mexico, even move abroad. Ford isn't the only American company to cancel jobs here after threats to raise trade tariffs and even tear up existing agreements. The sense here is that when Donald Trump wins in America, Mexico loses. But there's much more than jobs at stake here. There are many other issues that make these two countries interconnected. The Mexican peso fell to a historic low the last time Donald Trump repeated his threats to erect trade barriers. The former foreign minister, Jorge Castañeda, told me Mexico's northern neighbours playing a dangerous game.
What Trump is doing now, at a very, very, very difficult time for Mexico, is stoking the fires. This is the contrary of 100 years of constant U.S. policy.
And what's at stake if those fires burn?
Instability in Mexico, which means thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people leaving and going to the United States.
Mexico may not have much economic leverage to hit back, but they do have a new piñata to smash at their traditional fiestas. As Friday approaches, Mexicans worry that a new determination to put America first could hurt much more than their national pride. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Mexico.
In his news conference tonight, President Obama talked about the dangers of fake news, and as we heard, Donald Trump talked about it again today too. There is no doubt it is hard to police, something the European boss of Facebook admitted to News at 10 today. She disassociated Facebook from such controversial content by saying it is a platform, not a publisher. On the other big theme of the week, Brexit, Facebook has worked out a way of measuring confidence about the economy from its small business database.
Born in 2004, Facebook is about to become a teenager. The company says it has 1.8 billion active users, 30 million of them in Britain. People and companies use the platform to network and share information, and the head of Facebook's European operation told me that some of that information shows small businesses in Britain are more optimistic than anywhere else in the EU, despite Brexit.
We did see a fluctuation in confidence around the time of the referendum, but a few months later it has picked up. People are feeling more confident now.
And Facebook has confidence in the robustness of its survey, but some of the information shared on its pages has proved wildly inaccurate.
There are quite a lot of fake news stories operating on Facebook.
Last month, the England rugby player James Haskell felt he had to post a video to prove he wasn't dead. And the Pope condemned the report shared on Facebook that he'd endorsed Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Last week, a Syrian refugee said he planned to sue the company. He was widely described as a terrorist after he posted a selfie with the German Chancellor.
We take the issue of misinformation, the issue of hoaxes very seriously. And we made recently, just back in December, a number of announcements as to what we were doing as a company to address this.
Facebook is running a trial in Germany, encouraging users to report stories they believe are fake and employing third parties to vet them.
You've rolled these changes out in Germany. Is that because you're worried fake news might influence the outcome of the German election?
No, it's absolutely about the fact that we've committed, that we've understood that misinformation and the area of hoaxes is something that matters to people and it matters to the community. So we're committed to doing it all over the world.
How much of the news on Facebook is made up?
So I don't have the actual numbers, but what I do know is it's a very, very small proportion of the news that people see.
For a large number of people in Britain, Facebook is the gateway to the news that they get. You are in the news business, whether you like it or not. Do you accept now that Facebook is a publisher?
No, we're not publishing. We're a platform that people can come to in order to put their news stories out on, and there is a difference.
The difference is Facebook doesn't want to be liable for the things users post.
So let's do this.
Mark Zuckerberg listed the company 4 years ago and it's proved a runaway success. But with popularity and power comes responsibility and much greater scrutiny. Facebook has yet to demonstrate it can cope. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Hundreds of British holidaymakers who have been enjoying some winter sun in the Gambia in West Africa are about to touch down back home rather sooner than they might have hoped. They have been evacuated from hotels and resorts there because of the possibility of trouble breaking out over the president's refusal to step down. The holidaymakers are probably getting out just in time. Troops from Senegal, which supports the man who beat this man, President Jammeh, in December's election, are gathering on the border tonight. When the Ebola virus started taking hold in West Africa 3 years ago, the race was on to find a vaccine. Now, a different race is on. In the past half hour, scientists say they are trying to work out which disease will be next big global killer and create a vaccine before an epidemic strikes.
For 3 years, the world has been on edge. We've seen Ebola, which killed more than 10,000 people across West Africa, and the Zika virus spreading rapidly across South and Central America with devastating consequences for young lives. Doctors and scientists managed to control these outbreaks, but they know their luck may not last to future ones. So now, a bold new initiative to produce vaccines more quickly ahead of the next pandemic.
It's about doing the preparatory work beforehand rather than trying to figure out all the frameworks and ways in which we need to act during an epidemic when everyone is in a heightened state of anxiety anyway.
It normally takes a decade or more to license a new vaccine. Scientists at labs like this are already working on vaccines for the kinds of viruses that might cause the next pandemic. And what this new initiative will allow them to do is to fast-track and develop their most promising vaccines, so that if there is an outbreak, those vaccines will be ready to be deployed in the field straight away. The initiative will target 3 viruses first. The MERS coronavirus, a respiratory illness first seen in Saudi Arabia, where 4 in 10 patients have died. The Lassa virus is a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, seen primarily in West Africa, where it's spread by infected rats. And the Nipah virus causes encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. It killed more than 90% of those infected in a 2005 outbreak in Bangladesh. For scientists, the new coalition is a welcome boost that means they're not starting from scratch when the next outbreak hits.
And that will mean that we've already got information on whether the vaccines produce the right kind of immune response in people, whether they're safe to use, whether they work in older people and children, as well as the first age group that we start testing in, which is always healthy young adults.
If it all works, we might see images like this far less often. Alok Jha, News at 10.
Finally tonight, long before there was the rightful focus there is now on women's sport, one name blazed a pretty lonely but bright trail. And quite a name it was too. Rachel Hayhoe-Flint. Now, at the age of 77, the cricketing and sporting all-rounder has died. She captained the England side that won cricket's first Women's World Cup and popped up regularly on radio and television. Baroness Hayhoe-Flint, as she later became, also served another sport, football, as Vice President of Wolverhampton Wanderers.
Rachel Hayhoe-Flint was unquestionably a pioneer. Her England career spanned 22 years, and she was captain when they won the first ever Women's World Cup in 1973. An all-rounder in the broadest sense of the phrase, Hayhoe-Flint even played for the England hockey team. She was a formidable opponent off the pitch too, embarrassing cricket's 200-year-old men's club, the MCC, into allowing women members for the first time.
It's quite unbelievable. I never imagined that it could happen, but, you know, God takes a few years to work miracles, and perhaps I've succeeded in this respect. It's absolutely wonderful.
From the very beginning, Hayhoe-Flint was as good a campaigner as she was a cricketer.
She was passionate about women being given every opportunity in the game, whatever level, as a participant, as a member of the MCC, as a member of the media. She was devoted to seeing those strides being made for our sport.
A single-figure handicap golfer, after cricket, Rachel Hayhoe-Flint turned her hand to journalism. She also became a director at her beloved Wolverhampton Wanderers. Later, she'd be made a vice president there. In 2008, an OBE followed the MBE she'd already been awarded, and then in 2011, Hayhoe-Flint was made a life peer.
She did a lot for charity. She worked very, very hard with the Lady Taverners and the Lord Taverners, and we've now got something like 2,500 schools, under 13 and under 15, playing girls' cricket. And that's the sort of lady Rachel was.
Rachel Hayhoe-Flint possessed a rare and unbreakable spirit. She leaves behind husband Derek, their son, 3 stepchildren, and a legacy unrivalled in women's sport.
Sporting personality and pioneer Rachel Hayhoe-Flint, who died today. That's all for tonight. Join Tom tomorrow in Washington on the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration. But from me and everyone on the programme tonight, Good night.